Well, thank you. Hey, so good evening. I'm Dr. Michael Oldham from Texas A&M University of Commerce. And with me is Leighton Phillips, our glorious leader from SFuels, and Dr. Dan Plews. Just Endure IQ and everything else awesome with the endurance world. So thanks thanks y'all for attending tonight. Just here's our people, and they'll be talking tonight. If you've got questions, feel free to just throw them in the chat, or we've got time at the end, plenty of time at the end to get all your questions answered. I know as it was for me with this first meeting, I kind of went to a million questions started spilling around in my head, and so I finally got them answered. So so don't feel like you need to store those up. Throw them in the chat, and we'll get them addressed as we can. All right, take it away.
Yeah, so hey, thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate catching up. Leighton Phillips started SFuels back in 2015, so fairly new company, but ran like a lot of companies in this space. It just felt at the time that there was room for innovation and missing opportunities for products to serve a need for the endurance industry. Back in 2015, we started developing some products in some labs in California. Dan had been a low-carb, high-fat athlete for some time, but we caught up in 2017 and started working with Dan on some product development. And he went on to the next year to Hawaii to set the new course record. Whilst there, Dave Scott heard about SFuels. He joined the company in 2018. We continued developing some more products in this low-carb arena. At that time, we really were more focused in the triathlon community, began to be engaged into the ultra running community. Zach Bitter, maybe some of you are aware of Zach, 100-mile world record holder, heard about us. We got engaged, developed some more products for him. He went and set on a new world record last year with SFuels. And then Michael has since joined us, and between ourselves and Dan, we felt like there's just a large education requirement to build into the coaching community, the athlete community. So Dan's company, Endure IQ, leads that, and I'll let Dan talk to that. We're continuing to add, obviously, more product development, and we'll talk more about that as we get into some of the science of it tonight. And we'll also adding some new athletes as we speak. In fact, you'll see them at the Olympics in Tokyo performing. So it's a new company really in the scheme of things, but certainly making good progress. And great to be collaborating with Michael now to have this coaches on ramp and athletes on ramp program. And Dan and his Endure IQ company is a key piece of that. Dan, you want to make a few comments there?
Yeah, I guess, our introduction when we first started, I was an athlete, I've been doing kind of low carb since 2012, 2013. And, it was one of those things that was a gap that I felt was there. And when we got in touch, the idea of having a product that meets the demands of exercise and the requirement of someone who doesn't necessarily want to be chewing down on sugars all the time, wasn't there, and SFuels filled that gap, and since then it's been developed more and more things, and we've learned along the way, and I think everything's continuously evolving. All right, so I guess the idea of this webinar, so to speak, is to give a bit of a background on what is metabolic flexibility, what is fat oxidation, how can we actually look at that, and why is it important for specifically long distance triathlon performance? And I think that's one of the key things, and that we're focusing on here. We're not talking about performance in general. We're talking about ultra performance, specifically really over 4 hours. But for the long distance triathlete, at least, having been involved in this sport for a very long time, having coached a number of athletes and been at a number of Ironmans and races, there are three key things that seem to be quite evident and almost quite sad to some extent, is that you will see many athletes doing Ironman, often hitting the wall, particularly in the last 40K, and then walking the marathon almost from the start, or walking the last half of the marathon at least. Many athletes also have gastrointestinal distress. So you just have to go to any Ironman and you can see the people who are vomiting on the side of the road or have some sort of stomach problems. And it's the #1 cause of complaint in long distance triathlon is gastrointestinal distress. And actually the Cairns Ironman's just been by, and I heard someone say that they've never ever seen so many people spewing in T2 as they saw in Cairns Ironman, which I thought was quite interesting. So this isn't a problem that's there, and doesn't seem to be a problem that's getting any better either. And the last is, even though people can be training 15, 20 hours a week, they still seem to be unable to get a good body composition and maintain a good healthy race weight, or at least close to race weight all year round. And like, just from my own background, when I was at university, this is definitely something that I really struggled with. And I was a very good junior and a youth, and I think this is one of the main things that probably unraveled me in my early days of triathlons, because pretty much I was given the wrong advice about fueling, the wrong advice about what carbohydrates actually doing and how much you really need. You know, it's not really, don't eat a whole loaf of white bread per day and expect to see good things out of it. And I think that's one of the things that we're slowly learning and getting a good handle on.
Yeah, maybe Dan, I'll post up in the chat area too a link to an article we wrote on that gut issue for folks to take a look at later. I'll put it in the chat area here.
Yeah, cool. So when it comes to long distance triathlon, by trade I'm an exercise physiologist. I've done a lot of work in a number of sports, not just long distance triathlon. I've worked with Olympic rowers, been to the Olympics twice, Olympic kayakers. So it all comes to determinants of performance. So as a physiologist, you look at the sport, you look at the determinants of performance, and then you kind of build a program, or at least you build an idea of what needs to be worked on. And when it comes to long distance triathlon performance, it's very clear that there are certain things that need to be addressed, certain things that people need to think about when it comes to performance. And those things would be, from a very simple physiological standpoint, that most people will test in a lab, might be VO2 max, the aerobic threshold, which is close to your Ironman pace, the anaerobic threshold, which is closer to your 40-kilometer time trial, 10-kilometer pace. Then there are other things from the nutritional standpoint that are really important. So when it comes to performance, you have to consider, firstly, the amount of carbohydrates that are coming in. So exogenous carbohydrates, which is the carbohydrates that you'll be taking, how much are you taking of that per hour? Because that is directly affecting your endogenous stores. So if you're taking more exogenous carbohydrates in, it can therefore be affecting your endogenous stores. Then at the same time, what's really affecting the endogenous stores, perhaps even more so than the exogenous carbohydrate supply, is the individual's maximal fat oxidation and fat max. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail now. And this was a paper that was published by this Swedish group. It was Fransden. And amongst other things, it looked at, okay, what are some of the variables and what really has high implications for Ironman triathlon performance? And over all the things that they looked at, the thing that was the second highest next to VO2 max in this particular study was maximal fat oxidation. So you can see that it really is actually a key component of triathlon, of long distance triathlon, just like threshold, just like VO2 max. So with that said, if this is something that's an area where you are lacking or it's a weakness, it definitely needs to be addressed, because it does have implications to your triathlon performance. And just on that, we've just published a paper that looked at the same thing. We were modeling actually 30-minute time trial performance after 2 hours of exhaustive exercise. And in that paper, we showed that at least 2 to 3% of the model can be explained by peak fat oxidation. So it's not just now in this one paper, we've actually just showed it again. It's about to be published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. So yeah, it comes back time and time again that peak fat oxidation is actually something that we need to be concerned about as coaches and as athletes. And of course, we're flexible by design, and we are designed to be good fat burners. But one could argue that simply through modern food availability and high processed diets, too much carbohydrate during exercise, we almost blunt this response. And if you think about it, a human body, even the very leanest of individuals, they will have like about 1,500 to 2,000 calories in the form of stored glucose, or stored glycogen, which is in the muscle and in the liver. And then also, but then on the other side, we have around 45,000 calories of fat. And that would even be in a very lean individual, will still have high levels of fat. And what the problem is that we simply can't access the fat and use it as a fuel effectively. So if you think about what that means, it's a bit like a fuel tanker going down the road. And of course, that fuel tanker, when it's going down the road, it has to fill up with fuel all the time at every petrol station because the engine is running out of gasoline. But if it could just simply link a tube and then start churning in from the gas that's in the big tanker at the back where it's got all the fuel, then therefore we could actually go a lot longer. And that's kind of one of the things what I like to think about. I think it's a great analogy to understand what the problem is. The problem is that many people simply do not have the ability to access their fat and use it effectively as a fuel source.
So the way that we envision this and the way that we've really sort of broken it out is there's sort of the better way of going about this low carb, high fat, and utilization of the products in terms of better and best, right? So there will be a number of athletes, and we think actually this probably represents a large percentage of the athletes who trend towards the left side here. And they optimize their training and they can use better race fuels, train and racing fuels, and they can be slightly low carb, but then they can also utilize things like start low, move to high in terms of carbohydrate intake as race intensity goes up, and then timing their carbohydrate intake. And we recommend, lowering that carbohydrate intake 3 to 4 hours prior to initiation of the exercise to blunt that insulin effect. And some of the outcomes that we see in that are really just improving that fat oxidation that Dan mentioned. And so not only are we in that 80-20 sort of split training methodology and utilizing that fat oxidation pathways, but it also helps us to maintain a better glucose level throughout the day. And then certainly by utilizing these fuels, reduce our propensity for gut issues, and then just overall better health outcomes. What we also see though is if you can trend towards this low carb, high fat lifestyle, where now it's using diet to optimize that, that fat oxidation plus adding onto it both train and race plus fuels. Now we're shifting between those two fuels and being able to shift to a lower carbohydrate and higher fat intake, and all of the strategies that are involved on the other side. But we're also looking at increased salt intake and increased electrolyte intake, priming and stimulating that fat oxidation through the training process and the training sessions, and then making sure that we're reinforcing those mixed metabolic pathways. And so then what we see out of that is an optimized fat oxidation, enzyme volume, efficiency rate, utilization by the mitochondria, optimized fat oxidation rate overall. And now we can access the tanker and back. And then being able to, because races are not just flat and single intensity, but we've got those opportunities where it's a high intensity environment. Now we can still utilize those glucose and glycogen pathways, but we're going to spare that until we actually need it for those high intensity bouts. And then, like Dan mentioned, that now we've got really the possibility of reduced gut issues and lower inflammatory loads overall, and then being able to really, and this comes from my perspective, like as an older athlete, being able to recover from those sessions and bounce back, and 12 to 15 hours for an older athlete might be quite a large volume and quite a large training impulse, but being able to bounce back from those on a daily basis is highly profitable for me.
Hey, just besides that data, Michael, Dan, an elephant in the room that you hear a lot about, and I would imagine some of the folks on the call here, there's this question about high intensity being muted, ability to dial up high intensity, if you will. Your response to that for a low carb?
Yeah, well, we've actually published the data to prove it. So we published a paper that was in the Journal of it was from the journal, but it was that we have some counterparts in Czech Republic, and we published a paper that we went on a very low carbohydrate diet for 12 weeks, and we looked at the effects it had on high intensity interval training. And so the high intensity interval training was pretty much short intervals, but it was done at 115 to 120% of your threshold, and there was no difference after a period of adaptation. So after 6 weeks, there was no difference in the athlete's ability to do those intervals. And also, like I always argue that if you do happen to lose a little bit of your top end and your target is long distance triathlon, so what are you going to take? What's the most important thing here? Do you want to do a fast 1 minute, or do you want to do a fast Ironman? It's sometimes you have to borrow from somewhere else to give to the most important part as well. And I think that's also a really important consideration.
Yeah, got it.
So anyway, we'll get into we're actually getting into a paper a bit later on as well, which was more acute than long term, but it does also show how at least not eating before exercise doesn't really affect the ability to do high intensity either. But a good way to kind of prove a point, or a good example, is always look at a case study of two individuals. For those of you who have done LDT 101, I apologize, you've probably seen this before, but what's wrong with a good refresher? So this is a bit of a refresher. So this is a case example of two athletes. So one is myself, and this is not made up data. This is real data. So this actually happens with data from the lab. So two athletes, we have me and we have Matt Kerr. So Matt is actually an SFuels athlete now. So Matt met Matt in 2018 when he was being coached by Professor Grant Schofield, who works at the same university as myself. And Matt wanted to do Ironman. So, Grant Schofield is a big leader in the world of low carb, high fat, particularly for health. So we tested him in the lab, and the results came out that it just shows that me and Matt at that time were actually very similar. So our VO2 max levels were quite similar, and our weight was quite similar. But also our economy, at least cycling, was quite similar. So this is just VO2 on the left and liters per minute, and then power on the x-axis. You can see that when you look at this, you want a lower VO2 for a given work output, which means you're more efficient. And me and Matt are really quite similar. If anything, Matt's maybe fractionally in front of me, but you wouldn't really call that anything substantial. So yeah, let's just say that we are in fact the same. But of course, the question is clearly Matt and I are quite different. At that time, I just won Kona. Matt had never done an Ironman. He hadn't really done anything in the area of Ironman. So what was the difference? But when we looked at our fat oxidation levels, you can see massive differences, and we can do this in the lab. You can use something called a metabolic cart. We can measure expired VO2 and VCO2, and we can look at the substrate, what we call the substrate utilization, and look at the amount of carbs versus fat being used at any time point. And this is generally quite effective to about 80% of VO2 max. But once we get over that, it's actually quite difficult to really have a good estimate of carbohydrate and fat. But with lower intensities, it's a pretty accurate measure. And you can see that if you look at the top graph, the point at where I start using mostly carbohydrates, for example, is just above 300 watts. Whereas on the other side, from the very start, Matt would be almost predominantly using carbohydrate regardless of any intensity. So even at less than 150 watts, despite the fact that he's going towards near 400, he's immediately using carbohydrate and therefore reducing his endogenous carbohydrate stores. And this resulted in what we call maximal fat oxidation, which is measured in grams per minute. So I was at 1.223. This has been measured much higher than that, and we'll get into more details than that in the future. But Matt's was at 0.52. And what was also really important is where that occurs, because you want that to occur at an intensity that's close to the intensity that you're racing at. And mine was, you consider I would do an Ironman at around 260 to 270 watts. That was pretty much spot on for myself. Whereas if Matt was trying to do an Ironman at close to 260 to 270 watts, considering our thresholds are the same, it's going to have a massive difference in terms of his ability to have good durability in the process. And this is just another way of looking at it. I think people can understand this a little bit easier, is that at 270 watts, then you can see, therefore, myself compared to Matt in terms of the amount of carb versus fats. And you can see that at 270 watts, most of my energy is actually coming from fat. Whereas on the other side, nearly all of the energy from Matt's perspective is coming from carbohydrate. So what we did is actually, this is actually from, we developed a model where you can actually model endogenous carbohydrates depletion during the course of any event, but in this particular case, an Ironman. And this model is from a published paper. We published this paper in the Journal of Sports Medicine, which is one of the biggest, most prestigious sports and exercise journals there is. So, you know, good peer review process. So the model is quite solid. And you can look at, okay, with someone with a known fat oxidation and a known power output and a known fueling intake, what's happening to an individual's endogenous carbohydrate stores. And you can actually predict when that person will hit the wall and have some serious serious problems when it comes to finishing the race. So in this model has my fueling model from Kona, which is actually what I did. So 20 grams post bike, 50 grams during the bike, and then 110 grams for the entire marathon. That's not 100, that's not per hour. That was 110 grams for the entire marathon. But for the model, we gave Matt 60 grams per hour the whole way through. We have normal economy values because economy is an essential part. Obviously, the more economical you are, the lower your overall energy expenditure, and that's also an important aspect to think about. But we put me and Matt at the same economy, and that was basically the normative values from research that's published. And then also we put me and Matt doing the same power and the same running speeds.
By the way, it's probably worth calling out that Dan ran 2:51 marathon on that.
Hey, it was 2:50:48, and I'm
there you go. Apologies.
So this is what the model will actually look like, and you can see that. So we're assuming that both of us start off with about 800 grams of endogenous carbohydrate supplies, which is, you know, for our size and weight is reasonably reasonable. And then you can see what the steepness of the line of what's happening during the bike section, until the point of where on the red line, which is Matt, you know, he'll be hitting around 40K on the way back, and it's going to be pretty much game over, and there's going to be some serious hitting the wall, which will likely be resulting in a walking of the marathon. Whereas on the other side, if you model it with a higher fat oxidation, you can see that that's just never the case. And in my particular instance, I probably hit it almost perfectly with the amount of carbohydrates I was taking to actually finish the race in just the right spot. And this was also just some data from that race itself. What I did is I modeled, I looked at the splits from the top, I think it was the top 12 male pros, and looked at my position within the top male pros during the course of the marathon from the splits that are available. And you can see that, you know, I start off probably a little bit too hard. Then I'm in kind of in 9th position, 10th position, 8th position. And the difference being is that I didn't actually set off any faster. I just purely held my pace and didn't fatigue at the same rate. So by, you know, the last couple of miles, there was only, by that point, was Patrick Langer running any faster than me, because the ability to utilize fat as a fuel source and therefore not slow down and not hit the wall and not blow. And what I really like to think about is, you know, if you're into the high carb, if you're into the low carb, high fat regime yourself, I don't think it matters whatever the individual, because we always have to think about fueling for the type of work required. And if you're doing an endurance ride, why fuel on carbohydrates when it's really the main aim of that is to actually it's to try and upregulate your fat metabolism and improve fat metabolism, because that's going to have great, massive consequences towards the race. So we know SFuels, this is the method that we developed, is that with SFuels train and then SFuels race, we have that very thing in mind, in that you fuel for the work required. If you are doing your low intensity rides, SFuels train is by far the best fuel you can probably have. Maintaining energy balance as well is really important. But then on the other side, as you go up, then of course, perhaps some carbohydrate inclusion is going to be the way forward.
Yeah, the development that we worked on, to Dan's point, that he's been making as it relates to creating a product to support training, and particularly one side of training, which is the more aerobic, long, slow distance, if you will. What we're trying to do, as much as trying to have a caloric support in a training product, a hydration product, and a fueling product, the formulation is really about triggering lipolysis, triggering the enzymatic activity that happens, whether that's at a muscle cell level or elsewhere, is really to tune that enzyme, those enzymes associated with the breaking down of fat, utilization of fat, and how the body handles different types of fat is very differently. If you were to take an olive oil versus a medium chain triglyceride versus a small chain fatty acid, how the body handle that is very different. And the fat that is most efficient from an energetic and fueling muscular tissue is your medium chain fatty acids. And they come through the gut very rapidly. They do not go through the lymphatic system. They go straight through the blood system. And they basically come in through several enzymes. And that's what you can train with diet, with a product like Train. When we get into the higher intensity, whether that's higher intensity training or racing itself, clearly we want to also make sure that through training and through diet, we still have those enzymes responsible, particularly the latter end of the enzymatic process for breaking down carbohydrate and releasing energy. That PDH, that last enzymatic activity, we want to make sure that that is tuned, and we do that through providing not a simple sugar or a maltodextrin, but we use a what's called a branch chain starch. And all that means is that you take a starch and you treat it with an enzyme and you break it up. So it comes through the gut really well. It hasn't, a lot of these carbohydrates actually are effectively very light. And by being light, they actually sit in the stomach. They essentially do not go through the stomach rapidly. That's probably the simplest way to describe it. But then it comes through the gut, and then like a starch, it breaks down, obviously, as it comes into the circulatory system, and then it comes into the muscle cell, and it's treated like any form of glucose. So at that point, though, what a key, structure that we build these products and the use of these products by is that, and you can see it calls it out on this slide here, is as we get into high intensity work and we do look at the use of carbohydrate, we say to do that. I think Michael mentioned earlier, 3 hours after, 90 minutes after beginning a routine, a session, whether that's training or racing. And the reason for that is it takes around about 30 to 90 minutes, depending on the intensity, for the GLUT4 channels, certain channels in the muscle cells to open up, and for the carbohydrate or the glucose to come into that muscle cell without insulin. And that's really important, because being without insulin, it's really then that it has the ability to parallelize the oxidation of both fat and glucose at the same time. You don't have this insulin going up, which switches off the fat oxidation. You want to be oxidizing both simultaneously. And the way we do that is having that delay before we actually start it. And that's really what optimizes then for your race or your high intensity training session, oxidation of both fat and carbohydrate at the same time. There's other products we've built here. We're working on some products that really trigger upfront some of the lipolysis to turn on, which are caffeine based. But this is what, whether it's Dan or other athletes now are using around the world, using this SFuels protocol. So maybe I'll leave it there. Michael, there may be some questions later for us to drill down on.
Okay.
Well, I will just add, just go. You skipped a slide, Michael.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I will just add to what Leighton said there as well, in that before SFuels was around, as someone who was doing this low carb diet, there was no choice, absolutely no choice in what you had before. All you could have is you either had sugar or you just ate nothing. And that is not the best way forward, right? Because at the end of the day, relative, REDs and relative the energy deficiency and keeping calories are still important. And I think that's something that's often misunderstood and misinterpreted when it comes to lower carb training. Anyway. So I wanted to just finish off with, on the science side, at least, with, that kind of alludes to what Layden was saying at the start, was this idea that, carbs, if you don't have carbs, you can't do high intensity exercise. And, what's happening with the type of food that you're eating before. And it goes to show, and lo and behold, as you'll see in this study, what you eat before exercise does actually have an effect on certain things and doesn't have an effect on certain other things. So this was a study that was just published in the Journal of Nutrients, and with my PhD student, Jeff Rothschild. And what we did is we said it was very acute, and we looked at, okay, what's happening if we feed someone just carbohydrates before, we fast someone before, or we feed someone protein before. And that is before two things. So we had like a submax event, and the submax was 5-minute steps. It was the first step was at 60% of the anaerobic threshold, VT2. The next was at 80% of the anaerobic threshold, VT2, and the last one was, and then the third one was at 100% of anaerobic threshold. And then we also went between the anaerobic threshold and what we called W max, which is kind of your maximum aerobic power. So the power associated with VO2 max, and we went at 20% between the VT2 and the maximum aerobic power. And what was quite clear is that if you had high carbohydrates, a lot of carbohydrates before that type of exercise, you are very much blunting your fat oxidation. So you can see that, protein and carbohydrates, protein and fasted was quite similar. Fasted was definitely at a lower intensity, at least at the 60%, was substantially meant that your fat oxidation was higher. But even though protein was still very close, and in 80 and 100%, it was actually the same as fasted. So this shows that, what you eat before exercise counts. And also something like a Life Bar isn't actually going to do anything to your fat oxidation. So we don't need to be fasted to get the same kind of fat oxidation response. And to me, that's really important. And it's really important from a energy availability standpoint as well, is that we don't need to be fasting, but having the right type of food is really important. And for those of you who don't know what SF means, it actually means spike-free. Well, the idea is that spike-free means that we're not spiking blood glucose. And I actually wear almost a blood glucose meter continuously. And to be honest, when I have an SFuels bar, you can't even tell I've eaten it, because that's how blunted the glucose response is and how flat it is, which is exactly what we want when it comes to insulin before, and therefore the fat oxidation. If we're not having a high glucose response, we're not having higher insulin, and therefore we're not blunting the fat oxidation.
So yeah, the $100 million question we get coming into race season every year is, what do I do race morning? Increasingly, athletes are using the Life Bar basically to give them something in the stomach, but they know that it's not mucking.
Yeah, I mean, for all the training that I do, that's the only thing I eat really. But yeah, anyway, but then the other side of it is, okay, there's the kind of low intensity side, but what about the high intensity side? So after we did the submaximal stages, the next part of this study was that the subjects then did six 3-minute intervals. The first 3 were capped at 100% of your threshold. So you had to just sit at your FTP for 3 minutes with 3 minutes recovery. And then the last 3 were maximal. So the subjects were instructed to produce as much power as they possibly could over those 3-minute intervals. And then we looked at the average and say, okay, is there actually a difference in performance? And there was absolutely none. There was zero difference between whether you were in a carbohydrate fed state, in a fasted state, or a protein state. It was the same all the way through. You can see that the average was 367 watts, 368 watts, and 366 watts. So and as many of you may know, that's not a small amount of power either. So these were quite well, highly trained athletes as well. These aren't even recreationals where you can argue that the more power you're producing, the greater the requirement for carbohydrate, because the greater the energy output. And then I guess the question is, we talked about Matt Kerr, we talked about him in the case study. Matt Kerr is now an SFuels athlete. He's going to be also doing some work with Endure IQ. And obviously I helped Matt make that initial transition when he first started triathlon. So whatever happened to Matt Kerr? So first off, he came into the lab, tested him, we got his values, and then we put him through a protocol. That protocol is from the LDT 101, the Endure IQ course, whereas basically the athlete comes in, they do 3 weeks of what we call cold keto, which is a very low carbohydrate diet, less than 50 grams per day. And then over about a 5-week period, the carbohydrate is gradually built back in into a point what we call the sweet spot. Well, not sweet sport, it's actually the sweet spot, where the athlete has low and stable blood glucose, they're feeling good with energy, they're recovering well, and their performance is up and high as well. And over that period, from just in that early period, 2019, Matt did his first Ironman ever in 9 hours 21. And he took his maximal fat oxidation, if you remember, from 0.52 to 0.9 grams per minute. But also that fat max moved from 135 watts to 240 watts. So there's that, and you think about what that means and implications to how well someone's going to do in Ironman with those sorts of values, it's going to make a massive impact. But Matt didn't stop there. And I think that this is where taking a strategic lower carb approach that has longevity, which is what we promote at Endure IQ. We don't promote a ketogenic diet for that reason. We promote a diet that has a high level of longevity and you can do for year in, year out with relative ease. 2021, 2 years later, just gone, Matt did Ironman New Zealand again. This time he went 8 hours and 27 minutes, broke the amateur course record. By this time, it's 3 years on the LCHF diet. But what's amazing is maximal fat oxidation, it went from 0.9 to 1.8 grams per minute at 310 watts. And again, you can imagine if that type of level with exercise feeding, Matt will almost be getting off the bike having not depleted any of his endogenous carbohydrate stores. And he could almost have run the marathon having not eaten a thing. That's actually similar to what I did in Kona as well. I got off the bike and I wouldn't have depleted much of my carbohydrate stores. And I ran with just 110 grams of carbohydrates for the entire marathon. So, it's quite clear and the science is there that you can't argue with the data that this type of approach works, this type of approach is effective, and this type of approach does have great benefits over specifically long distance triathlon.
I think 4 weeks later, Matt went on to set the Cairns record for the 70.3, just about 4 hours and something seconds. I forget what it was. Yeah.
So how do you, as coaches and athletes, really start to engage in this and want to go further? Well, first of all, just, you can actually click on the QR code here and it'll start the process for you. And it'll give you our quick start guide and allow you to, get a hold of some sample packs and really start to think about, how you're going to utilize this for yourself and or your athletes. And then secondly, start to optimize this. So now we can start to drill down much deeper with our optimization guide and really looking at some more specific data. So if you're really looking at, if you want the details of it, that's where this optimization guide will come in for you. And then certainly just continuing to educate yourself. And so being a part of that LTT 101 and getting with Dan and his crew and really digging down into exactly how the mechanics of what he explained with Matt, right? Is just how do you do that in the short term? How do you do that for really the long term? And that's kind of our ideal focus on this, is just not the acute one-off, is really how do you live this lifestyle and optimize it for the long haul? And we really like, you to enjoy the sport and be able to do it at a high level for a really long time. That's my goal, certainly. And then lastly, just, a couple of ways that you can engage with us in the community is certainly with Dan and his Endure IQ community, and then with me personally, just reaching out to me to discuss strategies of implementation of how you are fine-tuning it with your athletes and how we can assist you in that by either putting some more science behind it or giving you practical examples, real world examples, maybe explaining a little bit more into detail and just giving you advice and opportunities to reach out and ask questions directly. You can reach out to me just through my SFuels email address. And then here's just, some examples of what you might get in the LDT 101. Dan, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, with LDT 101, it's been a very successful course, actually. We've had more than 750 students through that course, and we've really had great impact on a lot of athletes. So much positivity has come out of that course with, PBs and all those problems that we talked about before, and gastrointestinal distress, body composition, hitting the wall, basically being mitigated with a good approach. So yeah, LDT 101 is the first of our courses at Endure IQ. We're now coming up to our fourth course, which is going to be published quite soon. But, LDT 101 came out just out of necessity that there was only so many one-on-one consults that I could do. So, we built out this course, and it's made up of 7 modules. You can see that we have, with health, LCSF fundamentals, training and adaptation. We actually have a specific module for the female athlete as well that's run by Dr. Mickey Willarden. And then also training and recovery, and tapering and racing as well. And then as part of this, we've also gone and pulled together a special promo code for anyone who's listening here, where if you want to do LDT 101, you haven't done it already. I saw a few names and faces that were familiar here already, who I know have already done LDT 101. So thanks for your support, and thanks for the continuing enthusiasm for this approach. But if you haven't done it and you're interested in doing it, do reach out. We'll give you a special promo code, which is enduriq.com/SFuelscoach. And you will get additional module for all around training intensity distribution from LDT 102, which is our second course.
Questions. Time for questions. So I'll open up the chat window here. So chime in or. Wow. No questions. We've done an excellent job then.
There's got to be one question.
Yeah. All right. So here's a question from Raymond. What would be some sample quote meals that you could have before training? Love my Life bars, but I don't always have access.
You want to have a crack at that, Dan, or I can have a crack at it?
So what are some of the things that, if I don't have Life bars available, I will generally go for nut butter. That's my that's the next option for that. That's kind of my go-to.
Yep. Do a little coffee and some coconut oil.
Yeah.
Yep. Gets a double whammy of the caffeine and the medium chain triglycerides in there. Deepa asks, how did you or do you measure fat oxidation during exercise? I'll give you a hint. Deepa's also a PhD exercise physiologist, so.
Well, we don't obviously measure fat oxidation during exercise in outside or in racing, but we measure it in the lab. So we measure using VCO2 and VO2. Look at we assess what the substrate use is, and then we infer it from the powers that they're doing during that race and build that model accordingly. So actually, if you look at the Journal of Sports Medicine, the paper was published in I think it was different horses on the same courses is the title. Maunda was the first author. I was the senior author on that paper. So if you want to know a little bit more about the model, you can look it up there.
I'll send it to you, people. How many DMs have you sent to Lionel Sanders after Sunday?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the question is how many DMs have people sent me about Lionel Sanders after Sunday? No, the point. Yeah, I actually have the amount of people who have asked me about it. But I have a strong philosophy that I never offer my services to anyone. I only I only offer my services when people ask. So until he asks me for help, I certainly won't be approaching him.
I think
Richard.
in context, it's just really gut wrenching to watch Lionel go through that. But quite honestly, it's if you look at some of the research papers on just looking at what's been done at both Kona through the years in terms of Ironman University research and also at UTMB and Chamonix on gut issues, you'll see that what you saw on the weekend, it's not like it's a unique thing. There's been now about 15 years of research papers just calling out this consistent issue on gut issues. So frankly, it was the reason we initially got into creating a product. It was really performance actually was something that we worked on secondary to the gut issue. So I put it up the top there, a whole article on that, and it does call out the research papers associated from both Ironman, Western States, and also from UTMB and Chamonix, the research papers associated with the gut issues. I think there's another question there, Michael.
Yeah, and we've got one from Richard, who I think was chiming in there. Richard, you had a question verbally.
Yeah, I was going to ask Dan, the data that you showed looking at the utilization of carbohydrates and fats were based on you and your mate exercising on the bike. What can you do? Presumably you can do the same thing running as well on a treadmill.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can do it for running. It gets pretty tricky to do it in the pool, although it can be done, but it's not something that we do very often. You can do it in a flume. But yeah, you can do it running just as easily, like super easily. I mean, any VO2 metabolic cart, as long as you've got VO2 and VCO2 and ventilatory VE, which is ventilated equivalent, then you're pretty sweet.
We've also got the capabilities to do that sort of portably as well. There are methods to do that where we can actually do it out on the track or live and record that data as well.
Okay.
So we have a question from Claudio it says, hi, I live in Mexico where it's hard to get my hands on SFuel products. Are there any tips for a low carb diet while training for 70.3? Still trying to get the products, but have been using periodized carb system in the meanwhile.
Yeah, it's certainly our optimization guide talks through, if you will, just dietetic principles aside from what we do inside of training and during racing, Claudio. There's a few countries around the world where getting products in is not simple for customs reasons. Plenty of athletes are certainly ordering off US and then having it sent through like a My Mailbox service in the US into European countries and Mexico, etc. But yeah, the optimization guide is probably what we've documented the best. And I'm sure, Dan, in some of your courses, you go into some of the more standard dietetic principles of low carb, high fat also.
And then second question here from Mark, what source of carbs do you recommend to prioritize? Potato, green veggies, etc. So how would you rank those?
Yeah, I think in a clinical setting, potato actually, it's an interesting starch depending upon how it's actually prepared. If you actually cook potato, let it cool, 50% of that starch will turn into a resistant starch, which has very little effect on blood sugar reactions. A lot of the work we did with the SFuels Life Bar on choosing the formulation there was using a classic, what you would do when you go to a hospital for a diabetes test, which is a glucose tolerance test. Well, if you do that with a potato and you just cook it, heat it, and have it, you'll see quite a spike in your blood sugars. If you take that potato and you let it cool and say you could have it as a potato salad with oil or whatever, however you like it, but cooled, you'll see a very different profile on how the body reacts to that starch. Most of those green veggies actually high in fiber, low in high GI carbohydrate and glucose, so they're mostly all right. And then similar to rice, if you heat it and cool it, like it's there's a few papers out that talk about the Japan paradox, where there's a lot of rice eaten, obviously, but you'll see that, and this is the traditional diet, you'll see that it's had cooled. And therefore, if you look at the body composition profile in Japan, except the last 20 years where they actually really introduced a lot of Western diet over the traditional diet. But you'll see that a lot of that is because the carbohydrate source, which is rice, is taken as a cooled carbohydrate. So that'll be my answer there.
Yeah, and really what you're looking for is, as you start to search foods and information on particular foods, if you have questions about them, just look at their glycemic index, and numbers that are really high in those respects. Those are the ones we want to put lowest on the priority, or avoid completely if we can.
And just on that same thing, one of the what Leighton was saying about the westernization of in Japan, one of the main things is the introduction of mayonnaise going on the rice. And I think, being someone who continuously monitors their blood glucose, one of the main things that will really get me is bad oil, canola oils, vegetable oils. Those are the things that you also have to be really careful of, because I think if they're spiking your blood glucose, they're also going to be doing nothing for your fat metabolism and your ability to use fat as a fuel at the same time. Yeah. So that's something that I think most people don't really think about, especially eating out and things like that can be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. Claudia asks, will this kind of metabolic testing and analysis be in LDT 104?
Yes.
Awesome. Mark says, makes sense. Then cyclists for the Tour de France are using rice cakes, cold rice, to limit the sugar spike. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's light too, by the way. Although one of the things that you'll see in a lot of processed rice and potato when it's converted to a powder and then reconstituted with water is a lot of the fiber formation mark is being altered, and that certainly has a what would have been normal, quite a low effect to blood sugar, becomes actually quite vicious on blood sugar responses. You can test this really easy, by the way. Everyone should own a blood glucometer and just get sensitive to how your own body reacts to this. You can do the same with ketone testing also. Yeah.
Which actually leads into David's next question. Thoughts on the Lumen device for measuring fat burn or carbohydrate burn via RER? The respiratory exchange ratio.
Yeah. Dan, you've tested a bunch of products. I've tested some. Do you want to make comment first, or?
Yeah, I always do a good job of upsetting founders when it comes to this sort of thing. So I try and keep my mouth shut, but so one of my friends was looking at investing, and I just told him what I thought, and I'm yet to be convinced, particularly from an athlete population, because it's just so affected by what you eat and your timing of you eat, and it's if you test it just after you eat, it's going to be high. If you test it when you fast, if you test it just after you eat, your RER will be higher. If you test it after a fasted state, it's going to be lower. So I struggle to understand how it's used long term, and I think it's interesting, but is it useful? I'm yet to be convinced, but I'm sure they're doing great things, and I'm sure they're just in the process of trying to wean it out, so to speak.
Yeah. I know, I'd agree with that, just in terms of timing and what that actually means. So really educating yourself on, what does that data mean for you, and how do you utilize that? Yeah, I'd agree. Claudio says, thoughts on the Super Sapien CGM sensor being banned by UCI. People are saying that the ban was an anti-bonk gadget. It was a performance enhancing device.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think, it goes to show that obviously it clearly does something, because they wouldn't ban something that wasn't effective. I think that goes to show that it clearly is doing something useful. What most people don't realize is that when you eat carbohydrates during exercise, it does not stop your rate of reduction in the carbohydrate in the muscle. Rate of reduction stays the same all the time. So even if you're eating carbohydrate during exercise, the rate of reduction of carbohydrate at the muscular level is still the same, which is why the only reason you're going to stop it in the muscular level is changing your fat oxide, is changing your substrate use. That's going to have the most effect. So the food that you're eating, all that it's doing is going into the liver. and then that's getting out of the liver and it's being pumped into the blood glucose, and then from the blood glucose that's being cycled and used immediately as a fuel, which is the exogenous carbohydrate supply. So the idea of having something where you can maintain your blood glucose with a timed eating has very good and strong scientific validation and efficacy. And you know, there has been a paper that was published where an ultra runner used the continuous glucose monitor during a race with great effect. So I think it's it's a pretty good. I was on the fence with it before, but now I think it's definitely something where you can look at your carbohydrate timing when you need more or less, and also use it just to evaluate your substrate use when you're adapting, and maybe you need to do something about it, because if you're someone who has really poor fat oxidation, it'll be really apparent because your blood glucose will dump and go down very quick. And if that is the case, you can do something about it. And the point of where you get much more level blood glucose is the point of where you're improving your fat oxidation.
I would say that leads to the next question a little bit, because
I was going to say,
you know, I would say that the Super Sapien device actually may be more influential to help people to know when not to take too much carbohydrate than to take more. You can always take more, but it's really hard for a lot of athletes to know when to back off, and hence the gut problem. So this last question, I can say that, you know, in the labs, we worked with all different types of carbohydrate before we chose. I mean, the obvious ones that you listed: glucose, fructose, also the maltodextrins. Either there's a gut problem, or in the case of fructose, there's a negative effect on GLUT4, that channel that allows the carbohydrate to come in. So we bypassed all of those. Maltodextrin also has a mild negative effect on GLUT4, also not as bad as fructose. So we bypassed all of that in the spirit of trying to avoid any gut related issues, one, and then two, making sure that it didn't have any interference with how GLUT4 was opening the channels to carbohydrate in the muscle cell. So we ended up landing on this branch chain starch, which is it's basically a cornstarch that, as I say, gets treated with an enzyme, and that's showing the most promise in terms of it actually has a very low osmolality, and that's really talking about its ability to come through the stomach rapidly. But then as it gets out into the bloodstream and it gets into the muscle cell, it's not interfering with those GLUT4 transporters, unlike fructose. So that'll be my response to that, Patrick.
Yep. Then the last question here: is it possible to get coaching only on the diet fueling side if we already have a training plan in place? So yeah, I mean, that's partly why we're here, just to start connecting. But then we can, you know, certainly move you towards the LDT 101, unless you've already taken that, and then continue to work you through those programs. But
no, there's no way he'd be asking the question if he's already taken it.
Yeah.
I know one of the things that, you know, we often get asked for meal plans and real individualized coaching, but you know, it's not something that I believe is the best way forward for athletes, because as an athlete, you need to take accountability and you need to take responsibility and understand yourself, because otherwise there'll be never any longevity in what you're doing. You need to understand why you're doing it. You need to understand the foods you can eat, and then you can do it long term. If you just have someone who gives you a meal plan, the understanding's not that great, and therefore you really hard to do it. And you know, the idea with LDT 101 is you can learn how to do it yourself, and then you can incorporate it into your own training by yourself without anyone else helping you, because you just simply can't. I just don't think it can be coached. You need to, you know, we always say that we train animals and we teach athletes, and the idea is that we teach athletes how to do things correctly.
Yeah, and you can Google, you know, diet plans for endurance athletes, and you'll get 11 million hits. But this is really just taking where you can fine tune it. And so Mark says for sure he'll get LDT 101, and then Claudia says, is there a code for LDT 101?
Yeah, we'll make sure that's available to you. We'll link that up somewhere. We'll have it sent out to the group. But it is EndureIQ/SFuels coach.
So EndureIQ/SFuels coach. This?
Yeah.
Patrick, last question here. We're 5 minutes over really, but it's good questions. What's the purpose and benefit of increasing the sodium and electrolytes?
Well, I'll talk just from getting fuel or hydration into the bloodstream, then I'll let Dan talk to at the muscular level. I think certainly what we've seen in a lot of low carb athletes as they go into it, you'll find that a lot of carbohydrate both is higher in sodium, one, and two, the way that the kidneys actually hang on to fluids in the body changes as a function of reducing carbohydrate, and the requirement then to ensure that you're replenishing sodium becomes quite real. So that'd be the first comment. Particularly, this is really most material, if you will, in that transitionary phase that Dan talked about, in that 2 to 3 week transition. If you are going to go through that cold keto phase, electrolytes can really help deal with that transition. As you come out on the other side of that, and you're sitting in that range from what, Dan, 50 to 150, depending upon the intensity of your training days, etc. You're generally getting sufficient between, what you're taking supplementally with sodium in an SFuels type product, and obviously your diet. Dan, I don't know if you want to comment from a muscular level on electrolyte and sodium.
Yeah, well, I think you and me differ a bit on how important they are anyway, later. To some extent, but yeah, I mean, I think everyone has some form of electrolytes when they do, and it's helping through osmosis. It's just helping things pass through into the muscle and therefore get uptaken. So I mean, I also have a course that's LDT 103 that goes into the role of electrolytes in a massive amount of detail. So
yeah, last question. Let me touch on this one, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead.
We get this quite a bit, and it's a good question. It's really this question about gels. So without saying what we're about to launch, we absolutely recognize the need for this. We have tons of athletes using, obviously, the Race Plus product during the bike leg. And the bigger question for a lot of athletes is, well, what do you do as you get out to the run? So we're working on both a product to address that. We anticipate, what are we in? We're in end of June.
July, tomorrow.
Yeah, so August, September, we'll have a product that is what you're looking for. And that's both a product as it relates to the fuel itself, and secondly, a very unique way of not having to tear into gels with slippery hands and getting sticky hands and putting litter all over the race course. So we're coming out with a solution for that. And let's get everyone's email, Michael, and make sure Matt's the first to hear about that product.
Yep. And then just, Dan, can you maybe speak to this? How did you get 50 grams of carbohydrate on the bike? Was it Race Plus? I mean, what was the source of that 50 grams?
well, when I did Ironman, Race Plus wasn't when I did Codename, it wasn't a thing.
We didn't have it.
Didn't have it. So
gels, yeah.
So we had the train product, and then Dan had obviously other products he had to use because we were still developing products.
Yeah.
So he's used it since then to good effect in New Zealand, winning the race Ironman there.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, so we'll sort of wrap it up here. If you've got additional questions, just shoot those to me directly. And then if I don't know the answer, I'll reach out to Leighton and Dan and get a clarification on them. But certainly we want to be able to get back information to y'all. And so Matt, I see your question there, latest on ketone esters during racing. Oh yeah, that's a whole nother hour. That's a whole nother hour of talking. So we'll get those answered to you. And Matt, I'll remember your question here and we'll chat about that. So we thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. Leighton and Dan, we always thank you guys for your time. And so we'll end it here, and we'll see you at the races.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
for
all.
joining. Bye-bye. Bye.
Good to catch you. Bye.
I'm going to hop onto another call, fellas. Thanks.
Yeah, likewise. We'll
We'll
be in
Bye.
touch and we'll wrap it all up. It was a good session.